This is lecture 25. It's going to be about pollution in cities in the developing world, focused on river pollution in Brazil's Sao Paulo. So here is a slightly blurry picture of the polluted rivers in Sao Paulo. Two examples are Tite and Pinheiros, two rivers in fast-growing Sao Paulo. I want to talk about the causes of this urban and environmental externality and potential solutions to achieve the win-win of urban megagrowth and improved environmental performance. So why are these rivers so polluted? No one pollutes these intentionally. It's an unintended consequence of megacity growth, millions of more people moving to Sao Paulo for the economic opportunity. They're not moving there to pollute the water. The rise of polluted water is a consequence of the increased scale of activity in the city. And just if you have millions of people living in close proximity, a fair bit of poop and garbage produced, apparently it's all being dumped in the river. And factories are locating close to the river and discharging their wastes and toxics into the water. And this creates a strange toxic brew. And it just doesn't smell good. The impacts, again, as an unintended consequence of growth: bad smells, low quality of life. That picture before was pretty ugly. And public health consequences. If this water somehow gets into the drinking supply, just the smells themselves can give you a headache. And if the water supply gets polluted, just the impacts from that, as we know in the infectious disease consequences if the drinking water supply is polluted. And this may especially affect slum communities where people may not have the resources to substitute to bottled water or other things that middle-class households take for granted. So there's an interesting environmental justice issue of who bears these impacts. Which people, probably poor people, live the closest to this stinking river. And this is a continued theme of urban slums clustering close to these disamenity places, these noxious sites, and in this case, this river. So as environmental economists, we're supposed to identify externalities and think about market and government solutions to these issues. From Sao Paulo's perspective, you can look at cities all over the world who over the last couple of centuries have wrestled with similar issues. I'm thinking of Mike Haynes at Colgate and his work on how New York City and other major cities solve their water pollution challenges. And it isn't rocket science. When you have millions of people producing a lot of poop, engineers have figured out how sewage treatment can be built to deal with all this waste. And in terms of average fixed cost, if there's some fixed cost like $50 million for this system, if there's 10 million people in the city, and if you could have charged them all equal, calculate the average fixed cost. Total cost of the infrastructure is the numerator, divided by the total number of people who pay for it, and that would be the average fixed cost. If you could tax everyone that amount, you could get this built. I mentioned before that manufacturing is a source of water pollution in Sao Paulo. Here, obvious environmental economics would be enforcement of private property rights. The water, there's a tragedy of the commons, and the polluter pays principle, that these factories have to pay for the pollution they put into the water, would incentivize them to change their game and to figure out ways to pollute less. Are these solutions feasible? This building of sewage treatment plants and of regulating polluters? An obvious issue arises here is that water treatment is costly. There's a large upfront fixed cost to building water treatment facilities. Who pays for this? In Brazil, there's a lot of income inequality, and people in the slums may not have the money, the upfront money right now to finance this. So there's several ways to finance a large local infrastructure project. The New York Times talks about the Inter-American Development Bank financing and offering loans to Sao Paulo to pay for this. Another mechanism would be local property taxes, but that presumes that Brazil's cities have up and going a property tax system where properties are appraised and some amount of that money is collected as taxes. So in California, you pay 1% of the appraised value of your house, and that goes to the state. It goes to the local government for schools and paying for other stuff. I'd like to know in Brazil whether that exists and what happens to that money. A growing city could also issue municipal bonds. A point that David Cutler and Grant Miller have made about the United States is in the 1930s or so, many U.S. cities financed their sewage systems because they issued municipal bonds. And so there's always questions with local public goods. What public goods do you want to provide, and how do you pay for them? We all want a free lunch of somebody else, a sugar daddy, paying for these. But if you have to pay for your own local public goods, how do you tap into resources to pay for projects that have a positive present discounted value? And one way would be to go to Goldman Sachs and Wall Street and issue in Sao Paulo, borrow money on the international market to finance these investments that would offer the benefits we documented on the previous slide. Now, I think there's obvious stakeholders here. In my first book, my 2006 book, Green Cities, Urban Growth and the Environment, I argued at length, mostly with evidence from the United States, that throughout U.S. cities, whether it's Chicago, Boston, there's a growing group of educated, urban, upper middle class households who are stakeholders who want green cities, blue skies, and rivers that don't stink, just in terms of quality of life and improving health. And the same thing in the developing world, in Brazil and Sao Paulo, is taking place as there's more and more urban, educated individuals, their desire to clean up these polluted rivers. But this raises a question of competition in the political arena. If there's growing demand for green cities, will any politician supply them? And there you get into issues of corruption and competitive elections. If cities in the developing world have competitive elections, then candidates can't be captured by industry. They need the 51% of the vote to be elected. And if a majority of citizens want green cities, you're going to see politicians pop up who will be willing to supply them. And this is how, through competition, we get greener cities.